Hey everybody, my name is Quentin Burgess, presenting my case study uh, for Module 14 here, Educational Law, course number 850. I do apologize for getting this in so late. I'm going to go ahead. I've got quite a bit of information on my slides here, so I'm going to try to summarize that and keep this as brief as possible. First thing I want to do is just go ahead and take a look at the case study itself. So in the case study, there's three main characters here. There's the principal, Mr. Sample. There's a teacher by the name of Mrs. Brandon who's new to the district but has taught previously at a different district. And then there's the librarian, Mrs. Lynn. And so, long story short, in the case study, the district had raised some money and allocated some funds for a computer lab in the library, and Mrs. Lynn was to kind of be the overseer of that. Within those funds and the allocations for the computer lab, they surveyed the teachers and tried to figure out what software and technology to put on those computers that would be the most effective for instruction for various teachers at the school. Now, a little preface about the school. It's a very small town, 2 grade level teachers per grade, K through 8 building. The principal had been there 3 years. And they're about 20 minutes or so away from the closest city. So the kids actually go to the city for high school. So just to paint a little bit of picture for you, it is a small town. There's a lot of small town feel in the story for sure. So what ended up happening was they purchased some software for the computers, and the librarian decided, in an effort to try to help the teachers out and to get the kids the most bang for their buck, that she would purchase some blank CDs and copy the software. So then the teachers would have those to use in their individual classrooms and on certain computers, which in fact is an infringement on copyright law, and at the very least unethical. The one point in the story that I wanted to highlight or emphasize was that they did talk about whether or not this would fall under a fair use provision. They talked about the copyright, or the software, excuse me, having a user agreement on it that stated that there would be no copying of said software, which I think would exclude even an educational entity from being protected under the fair use provisions enacted in 1976. So that's a little bit of the background of the story. When Mrs. Lynn presented the software to Mrs. Brandon, Mrs. Brandon felt really uncomfortable about it because at her previous district, they had been openly communicated with and educated in the theft of software and what that looks like, what they can do, what they can't do, and then obviously how to use that in their classroom. And so then coming to a new district where up until this point, or at least with the information provided in the story, none of that had been covered with the staff or the people there in the building under Mr. Sample. So she took that information to the principal, and the principal went on to talk to the librarian and then informed her that she was going to need to get rid of all of the copied software and that what she was doing was illegal. Mrs. Lynn was upset about the situation. She thought she was doing a really good thing for the district, saving some money for the teachers and the school, and really just trying to help the kids out. So while her intention was in the best of places, it still falls under a category where it becomes illegal and unethical. And unfortunately, the school and even Mrs. Lynn could have faced some jail time or fines or various repercussions based on the copyright infringement in the case study. So some of the things I just wanted to include here in my slide and things to consider. We talked about copyright law and this being a violation of that. Just to look at what copyright law is, it's an exclusive right given to a creator of a certain work. So in this case, the software, that individual has the right to recreate and to sell his or her work. And by somebody else copying that, they're essentially taking money out of their pocket, and the person who has the copyright material could sue them. For the money that they missed out on, or whatever it was, the value of that product. So fair use is something else I want to talk about as we go down to the bottom here. This practice has been used in over 40 countries, and it seems more accepted in the educational community than anywhere else. The biggest thing here is it seems like a lot of courts don't really want to try these cases or deal with these cases, and they usually tend to side with educational agencies. Now, it doesn't appear to me, in my experience and my my work in the school district here, that this is something that administrators or school leaders want to take a chance with. In my job, we've been communicated with multiple times about what videos to watch, what not to watch, how to use YouTube, how playing just even playing a movie at school during the holidays could get you in trouble because you're not paying the fees or whatever, charging ticket and admission and paying that money forward for the movie. So lots of stuff there to think about. And there, as I read through this and I thought about the fair use, I definitely thought there was some gray area. So I want to take you through a little bit of my thought as we move forward here on that. And I think, in regards to the fair use policy, like we talked about before, enacted in 1976, the reading and the that I found here through the Myths versus Fact article says that there's a standing principle of history for this type of a law that dates back to the 1740s. To me, the gray area in the case is in relation to the fact that the fair use provisions typically protect the nonprofit educational agencies. Part of their criteria is that the infringement must not result in any sort of financial gain. So the interesting part of this was that the librarian, Mrs. Lynn, wasn't necessarily selling the software to the teachers or to other schools or whatever, but in turn, she was actually saving the school money. So there was inadvertently a financial gain here. So I think that would constitute as a financial gain, and it would definitely could affect her legally if this was ever brought up by the people that wrote the software or own the rights to the software. Another important aspect I thought about this case was the user agreement that was incorporated with the software and that they had mentioned in the case study. So regardless of the fair use provision and the situation or the point of view of the courts, typically in these types of cases, I think that the user agreement and the software that details the user agreement and the software that details the purchaser is not supposed to make copies or sell or pass on that information or use it on multiple devices, so on and so forth, would void any kind of a fair use protection. So I did want to take a look at that. But as we break this down and just look at some of the law, the first thing I want to do is talk about a little bit how current legislation impacts the educational needs. I feel like there's quite a bit of leeway in what we're able to do in the educational world. And when I originally made this slide, I had this giant courthouse over top of this kind of tumbling over this schoolhouse, and that was my original thought as I began preparing this. That are just overpowering and you just handcuffed by regulations at every turn. But the more I look through the information, the more I tend to sway to the side, and believe that, public education is afforded different leeways and different liberties that most private entities would not be given the same kind of protections. And I think the biggest example of that is what we talked about with the fair use provision. I think one thing that kind of interested me was in the article here, copyright and K-12, who pays. This article was summarized by David Rothmans, and what they talked about was essentially how the relationship between schools and pirated materials that are used for educational purposes how it happens so often, so frequently that it's almost impossible to keep up with. And then he goes on to allude to the fact that the protections of copyright law are almost faded away when we're talking about educational setting, and that there's not really a definitive black line in this situation. That's very, very blurry and gray, if you will. I thought that was really interesting. I don't know that you would have that same I don't know that you could ever find that same opinion with some information to back it up in really any other field of study or any other field of employment. So I thought that was really neat. Based on my what would appear on my research, legislation has had little impact on the needs. In reference to copyright law and infringements brought against schools are rarely heard, like we talked about. Another big reason for that is that school districts often, like I said, administrators and school leaders don't want to deal with these things. So they do have policies and procedures and things in place that will are aimed or directed at preventing these things from happening. And I think another thing that to note is that by having these policies and procedures, I think school districts protect themselves, but maybe not necessarily the teacher as an individual. So something to think about as we move forward through the rest of this presentation. The next thing I wanted to do was to bring you through kind of my technology management cyclone here, if you want. And with my pictures here, I have the eyes overseeing everything, and I have the copyright logo on the computer, and the bags and bags of money that it takes to use technology effectively and manage all of that and make sure it's safe for kids and follow all the legislation that helps us keep that technology safe for kids to use without exposing them to different things, to protect their rights and so on and so forth. So the three big things here that I found in my research I thought worth pointing out were really just looking at the acquisition of technology and what that looks like. And when you're buying that much equipment at that much of a price and for such a big group of people, how do you handle that? And then obviously there's some upkeep to that. How are you going to maintain that equipment? How are you going to evaluate its effectiveness? How are you going to decide when it's time for new equipment? Do you purchase? Do you lease? What do you do? Are there bonds and grants? What kind of federal aid are you getting for those things? And then the third and probably the most common thing that we think about is the usage. I think we've all seen our technology usage policies in our districts, and we've talked about those in previous assignments. And so that was the third thing, and I thought one of the more important things, obviously, for sure. Using technology to improve quality and efficiency in operations. So to me, I think that when technology is used to improve school operations, you probably need to have a guideline. And one of the things I found from this Turney resource was that the three major emphasis when considering how to use technology to improve school operations. Number one, does the technology develop and support professional development that instructs teachers on how to use technology systems? So the teachers have to know how to use it. Who's going to show them how to use it? How are we going to use it? Is it effective? Is it applicable to what we're doing? Are we able to understand it and actually implement those things? Number two, utilizing technological systems that meet the needs of the students and families. Are we wasting money? I mean, I guess to me, that's the big question. Are we buying things? Are we using technological systems that meet our kids where they're at? That are they going to have a benefit from this? Are our students going to benefit from this? Are their families going to benefit from this? Or is this just something, while as an educational leader, it might sound great to me, and another school district 400 miles away might be using it, but does it work for my kids? Does it work for my clientele and for our community? So I think that's the second big thing you really want to ask yourself. And then the third thing here is overseeing those systems. What modifications need to be made? What updates are going to be necessary? How are you going to evaluate the effectiveness? What data are you going to use to drive your instruction with that technology? How are you going to use it in the classroom? And so on and so forth. So let's see here. One of the the neat things I found here was this table for selecting software and just kind of a criteria, some of the things they talked about here. And obviously you can look through this too, but the usability and functionality of the equipment, the cost benefit analysis. What is it going to look like when we have to upgrade, excuse me. Is the vendor reputable? Is it somebody we can trust? Are they going to help us out? Is the system flexible? Do we have to buy so many pieces to make it work? How are we going to manage it? Hardware and networking resources, and then other things here on the right hand side. What kind of training are we going to need? Who's going to oversee this? What kind of security is there? Is it safe for kids to use? And then you got to think about grade level. Are you working with elementary kids, middle school kids, high school kids? There's definitely some of that goes into it as well. And so on and so forth. I think the integration part of this. How easy is it going to be to implement? Are we gonna have a big headache when we go to put this in? Are there phases? Are there things that we've talked about? So all of these things are things that you need to consider when we're getting ready to acquire technology or to get new things for our district. What ways can we monitor our technology policies? We got a little piece of my slide here cut out at the bottom, but the three big things I thought were communication, education, and expectations. I think it's important that we always communicate effectively, not only the guidelines of our technology and what we're doing with it, but also information about copyright, what you should use, what you shouldn't use. Make sure our teachers know. You can't just assume people know things. We live in a world today where people are coming out of all different kinds of schools. They're studying online, they're studying abroad, they're studying in Kansas. I know we have people in our class from California. Some of the local laws in California might be much different than the laws here in Kansas. And, the funding streams are different, and the communities are different, and the expectations are different. So I think it's really important to communicate all of those things with your staff members, with your students, and obviously with the parents as well. Education, make sure that the kids not only know how to use the resources, but they also understand what's expected of them, and in a way of how to use them responsibly. So what they can and cannot do on those things. And the same thing holds true for our educators or our teachers as well. We want our teachers to know the difference between copyright infringement and you can use that because it doesn't have a all rights reserved or whatever the case might be. And then I think also expectations play a role in this. They need to be clear and concise and upheld. If there's a situation or an issue, I think as a school leader, sometimes those conversations have to be had. I think there's a way to have those conversations and still help staff and people feel valued. I also think that preventative measures are the best way to handle things. So again, jumping out in front of these things, having in-services that cover this kind of information when you're getting ready to implement a new technology layout, and so on and so forth. So my little piece down there at the bottom says provide guidance. I think that fits right in. Stay abreast on current trends and laws. And then the district needs to have a published user agreement and have some sort of usage standards, that we can reference and help everybody understand that we're all on the same page and we all want what's best for the kids. We talked earlier about teachers and students and parents all playing a vital role and all needing to be on the same page. So one of the bullet points here was that I thought teachers need to be trained and have comprehensive understanding of the district policies in regards to technology usage and how they relate to copyright laws and regulations. Students should have a comprehensive understanding of the clear guidelines associated with use of technology in school. Typically, the school planner enrollment would be an appropriate avenue to cover such items. I know in our planner, it goes through all the board policies associated with anything from technology to dress code to drug usage to zero tolerance, etc. And the students and the parents have to sign off on that during enrollment. The sad reality of that is I don't know how many of them actually, spend time reading through that. but I think there's some other ways that we could handle that with community involvement and parent nights and going over that information through those different means. Parents, we all know parents play a vital role in the education of children. It's important that they understand the policies set forth for the kids. We don't want there to be any surprises, but also we want to be reinforced. And we want the parents to feel like we are protecting their kids and valuing the time that we have with their children as well. Excuse me. Implementing technology. I found this chart online at Clarity Innovations, and I thought it was one of the best resources I've found so far this semester. Um, if you start here on the left-hand side, questions to consider when planning a technology policy. So number one, will the policy be followed in daily practice? And then number two, is it consistent with administrative regulations? And then moving on, the three considerations when looking at these policies. Are they focused on old technology that keeps users from utilizing new technology? Our policies often rely on banning to prevent inappropriate use rather than development of digital literacy. And number three, policies that try to anticipate specific violations often come up short as technology advances. And does the technology policy focus on student learning? Does it promote responsible use of technology, and does it meet current state or federal regulations? So I think those are all things to consider. I think this is a pretty brief, just kind of overview and some questions you can ask yourself as you're developing a technology policy. I know that the last bit there about state and federal regulations and all the laws and the things that you have to cover to receive certain strings of funding. There's a lot of things that you would break down from this, but as a general overview, I thought this was as good of a resource as there was out there, and wanted to make sure I shared that with everyone. Excuse me, should have brought some water with me. Once technology policies are in place and all the stakeholders have an understanding of the guidelines and the expectations, I think it's important to establish a protocol for monitoring the successful adherence to the policy. So, what are we doing to make sure that our kids and everybody else is following those policies? There it is. Excuse me. All right. So, using preventive measures such as meetings, staff development time, and reminders can and do serve a purpose. I think that's important. Like I said, be preventive, get out in front of these things, make sure people understand, make sure your teachers know what's going on. Excuse me. School leaders must also utilize IT personnel, firewalls, filters, and other means to ensure that all stakeholders are following set protocols. By actively educating staff and students on the policies and protocols associated with the technology policies, we are supporting and promoting both student and adult development. So I think it's important to not only think about our students' development and safety when it comes to new technology or existing technology. I think it's also important to think about the adults in the building and what they may or may not know, and how their development can only help further the educational process and better serve the needs of our students. School leaders should always evaluate the effectiveness of anything they're working on, especially technology that they're using. Their ability to monitor it should be evaluated, and whether or not the usage policies are adequately serving their purpose. I think utilizing trends and data to drive decision making is key for ensuring the best practices for everyone, and that the best technology is being used for those situations. One idea that I had and I thought would be really good would be to utilize a committee comprised of all the stakeholders in the district. So I'd have students, staff members, administration, and then parents and even community members work together to evaluate the needs and relationship to technology. Is the technology serving its purpose? Is it out of date? Are we monitoring the right way? What are some ideas as far as policies and regulations go. What are some ideas for innovation? And again, I think it's important to promote teamwork amongst all the parties involved. Not only do we get great feedback from this kind of a committee, but everyone has value in the process, which makes the community stronger, and obviously the school system stronger there too. As technology or the policies set forth for usage begin to expire in their effectiveness, it will be vital for school leaders to develop a plan to adapt and adjust their inventory and or policies accordingly. And again, I think this is something, another reason to have a committee or people involved, maybe once a month meeting to evaluate what's going on in that world of technology. Lastly, I'll end this presentation with this slide, and I just titled this "Essentially and Always." And I just wanted to break down three things that are really meaningful to me. And number one was, we always want to consider two things when making decisions, whether that's based on technology or anything else. You could think of any of the topics we've covered this semester. But number one, is it the best thing for the child? I think that's always the first question we want to ask ourselves. And then number two, is there data or evidence that supports question number one? So if I believe it's the best thing for the child, what data or evidence supports that? And then go from there. Number two, the second question, what is the most effective way to communicate a specific need with staff, students, or parents? How do I communicate with the kids? How do I communicate with the staff? And how do I communicate with the parents, and make them still feel valued? Not only understanding what the message is, but I also want them to feel valued, which is the third bullet point here. Are we making all of our stakeholders feel valued in this decision? So when I do make decisions, that's something that I consider. Unfortunately, sometimes we have to side with the Unitarian good, but always we want to consider these three bullet points. And I think the same thing is true when dealing with technology. And in this case specifically, the fourth thing I would add is ethical and legal. So I think as we reflect back on the case study, if you look at Mrs. Lynn, she asked first, the first question was, is this the best thing for the kid? I think in her mind it was, and I don't think that I would disagree with her on that. I think there is data and evidence that supports the software being used for instruction that would benefit the children. So I would definitely go all the way with that. And then I would come to the question of whether or not it was ethical or legal, in which case I would say it was not. So thanks again. I hope you enjoyed the slides. I hope I really liked the tables and the things that I found online to share with you guys. If you got any questions, don't hesitate to ask. Let me slide this out of the way so you can see the rest of my references there. But that is my presentation. Thanks. Have a great holiday.